Hey there! Tonight we're returning to the outskirts of castles and monarchs instead of medieval history as the portion of history that isn't shown in artwork. Peasants, those who survived plagues without wearing crowns or riding horses, hunger, cold, and 1,000 minor humiliations, all without a right to their name, honor, and legacy. Just long days, brief nights, and a peaceful sort of. Most of us wouldn't be able to survive a day in this type of serene, leisurely history. Helps you relax. Please feel free to subscribe and like the video, but only if it tells me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is, and it truly brings you calm. Now that the lights are dimmed, it's always oddly soothing to see who else is dozing off to the same peaceful tale. If you like a gentle background hum, switch on a fan. Settle in, and let's get started. There is no name for this settlement near the map's edge, or if it did, nobody would recall it. It is located in a shallow valley in the hazy, a gentle dip in the ground in the middle of nowhere, far enough away to avoid roads. If you had royal attention or records, you wouldn't see them on a map. Here is where the globe stops, but you have never, ever seen a map. When the trees first appear, the forest is dense and moves slowly, as if it were very old. The fields extend forth in a way that scarcely tolerates your presence. Erratic brown and green areas worked until they were exhausted. Then worked some. Additionally, there is a river to the north that you have never seen but have heard it referenced in the same way that one might talk about saints or monsters. The distance between your birthplace and your final resting place may be as little as 60 steps. Houses are sagging and uneven, as though the wind had pressed too hard against them. During consecutive winters, the walls are covered in mud. Twigs and straw that have been meticulously braided together and continuously patched using roofs are thatched and sagging, regardless of the weather. Constantly leaking under their own weight in areas where the village is not fully accessible, has a sour tang and smells like wet wool, smoke, and soil. You're no longer surprised by animals, a hint of damp decay, or anything else. It's the scent of. The entrance to the area where I live is a muddy footpath rather than a road. 2 grooves that are deep enough to catch rainwater have been worn by ox carts. Mosquitoes. Most days go by without anyone significant visiting for years, if at all. A chapel in a different community silently counts the hours with a bell if the wind conveys the sound. If not, you can use the sun's position or the depth of the ache that creeps into your back before morning, or the shadows on the field. Perhaps a dozen families are present, which would be sufficient to fill a small feast gathering. These days, everyone is aware of everyone else's issues, and until it becomes necessary to avoid the village elder, everyone courteously avoids them. A man named Tom, if you can call him that, once conversed with a monk and now repeats that exchange as evidence of his knowledge, and nobody challenges it. Tom's hut, his goat, appears healthy and hasn't fallen, making him as close to a leader as anyone. There are no recorded documents, deeds, or land here, thus nothing is exact. Boundaries of surveys are seen as being beyond the old elm, or at the école. If there is a disagreement, it is resolved with a quick shrug. Dispute, and occasionally a bread loaf passed back and forth, till nobody wants. There is no school, no pub, and no inn, so if a visitor shows up, it's spoken about for weeks. Are they cursed? Where did they come from? What do they want? Do they have a salty smell? The introduction of a new person is intriguing and rather terrifying, and nobody truly departs, making travel less of a plan, rather than a myth you've heard about cities, villages, or locations with stone structures spanned 2 or 3 floors high. Yet those are narratives that resemble conversations. You can't miss a world you've never seen. Whether it's animals or ladies who transform into birds, the hills are long and the forest is deep. If there are roads, they are more famous for what would you do even if you arrived? Bandits and poor luck are worse than any assurance of arrival. One of those far-off locales where you don't carry cash, speak any other dialect, and don't know the customs, doesn't even know your age, so you remain there since it's safe. Familiar, despite the difficulties, the boredom, the leaky roof, and the well runs low, and the same stew has been simmering for 3 days. Regular comfort, such as knowing where the firewood is and who to ask at what time. Knowing which patch of sky indicates when to bring in the sheep causes your fence to fall. When the light disappears, you work in the morning. There isn't much in between, but life goes on, and in some way, the peaceful rhythm of it all. There is a type of tranquility that doesn't require inquiries. To comprehend anything that is not visible from the top of the closest hill, you may occasionally hear about a conflict, the death of a king, or a frightening comet in the sky, a community 5 days' walk away, but you never seem to hear the news. Simply put, too many people hear these stories to give them any weight, therefore they lose it. Even time seems different here because of their hurry between the shepherd's cousin and the merchant. The seasons don't change smoothly. Instead, they blend together. For example, a wet spring turns into a strong frost after a rainy summer becomes the kind of winter that eats away at your boots. You count harvests, dry ones wet, rather than years. When the rye became black with decay, that was the bad one. The good one when old Marjorie and thick, heavy barley were used. Grinned for a week. His steward gathers grain, writes, and asks inquiries. You write things down and respond thoughtfully, never going into too much detail. Seems uninterested in specifics, and since you haven't seen the king, you're unsure. Leaser what he does, but you are aware of his name and surety, just in case, you repeat it during prayer. Important, since hardly much changes here on the map's edge, and when they usually do it for the worse, and the roof primarily contains the half-glowing, the cottage is cozy, and the sun will rise again tomorrow. Over the same hills, and that's plenty for now you will walk hundreds of kilometers in your lifetime, yet nearly all of them will be in. In the medieval countryside, the majority of people never went more than a few miles from their birthplace, not because they were uninterested or energy or boots, even though boots were frequently considered a luxury, but because they didn't truly own the world beyond the next hill, and the notion of searching for it seemed as unrealistic as flying when you were a child. Knowing the names of all the areas between your house and the border of the field, you were familiar with each tree stump's shape along the route to the red. Well, based on the depth of their imprints, you could tell who had traveled the road. The muck and everything else began to feel. In theory, it might just be 5 miles to the next village, but it might as well be had visited a distant nation and heard tales of people getting married there. Stole a goat that said you hadn't noticed the priest snoozing during Mass, and you probably wouldn't because traveling wasn't exciting or pleasant. The roads weren't kept up in the silent, laborious, and sometimes lethal manner. Trails that were largely muddy and marked with signs and travelers, fields, woodlands, and extended areas of quiet, desolate land without any maps or directions, only general guidance such as go till the leaning pine tree appears, and then to the left of the stone that appears to be a sleeping pig, and the woodland was the first thing to be concerned about on those paths. Medieval woodlands were dark and dense, not like parks or charming settings, packed with sounds and tangled with roots, making it difficult to recognize boars. Wolves are people who, if they weren't born in the wild, didn't want to be discovered. Since they had nothing to lose, they didn't want you among their second bandits. Travelers who had no land to work were at risk. particularly if they appeared to be a man strolling with purpose and even rather well fed, may be presumed to possess cash, and a lady may be traveling alone. Because she had something valuable to steal, you soon discovered that confidence wasn't the same as armor. Lost, so getting off course wasn't a small hassle. You couldn't follow a river downstream with no one coming to find you, and I hope the festival goes well, because you might go days without seeing anyone else, and your body might vanish. People wouldn't realize you were gone until the following feast day when you disappeared into the bracken like smoke. At last, someone inquired about you, and another person simply shrugged. Then there were the pragmatic issues of who you would be if you traveled too far. If the Lord Steward arrived, who would look after your field and feed the animals? You couldn't justify your absence to a man by collecting taxes while you were away. Keeping a ledger, your responsibilities didn't stop because you were interested in what was ahead, beyond the horizon, and what would happen even if you managed to reach another village. You weren't welcomed or expected, and outsiders caused issues. Illness, crime, weird concepts, and a somewhat distinct dialect that you spoke distinct expressions, perhaps even holding your spoon in a different way. You might encounter distrust, or worse, there was a lack of universal friendliness. Food was limited, and beds were sown. Home was the safest place because it was already full, not because it was especially secure, but you could tell which area of the roof it was, since it was familiar. Which neighbor might give you a tool? Which chickens went too far? Nobody owed you anything, so don't ask too many questions. Even yet, people traveled occasionally, usually not peasants, but traders, monks, messengers, and those who provide protection or a reason, or both. You may occasionally witness them arriving with carts full with, like smoke from a bonfire, wool or salted fish leave stories behind them. They described urban areas with stone structures and spice stores, and it sounded like people walking down streets that didn't turn to soup whenever it rained. It's improbable that you listened, but you didn't have high hopes since, even if it were real, if you couldn't read and didn't have any money, how would you behave in such a situation? Would be completely engulfed by the metropolis, and nobody would even be aware of your customs. Names, so you didn't stay out of fear, even though you occasionally were, but you had to take care of a fence, to fix a niece, to supervise the drying of some barley and a dozen other chores that all have to be completed before the sun set, and since you really didn't need. The community had enough talk, and the globe was larger than it was. It had the rhythm of bells and the weather, strife, illness and transient delights, seasonal changes, and the silent satisfaction of living another day. You occasionally had dreams about what was beyond the forest, but most of the time you just prayed the community had enough water, and the stew wouldn't burn while you were fetching it. Rumors, disputes, the weather, illness, and transient pleasures. It featured the sound of bells, the changing of the seasons, and the silent satisfaction of living another day. Wished to see what lay beyond the forest, but most of the time you simply hoped that, while you were fetching water, some individuals did depart, but generally the stew wouldn't burn. Sometimes a young man who is ambitious may go out in a desperate or dangerous manner. He might return with a job, an adventure, or a cause worth dying for. A limp, a narrative, or nothing at all, and nobody said anything when he didn't come back. Remarked, "He went beyond the trees," as if that clarified, and shook their heads. Life may have been small for those who stayed, but it was also, I knew you weren't truly alone because you spent your days with your family and neighbors. Repetition and familiarity provided solace for the animals and the land itself. Complaints. You didn't have to taste cinnamon to feel the thrill or see a far-off city to appreciate warmth, of delicious bread or traverse a kingdom to experience love, grief, boredom, or hope. And as the years passed and the pains became more severe in your joints, the idea of travel was born, as children grew taller than the fence posts, fading with awareness that certain people were destined to, not with sorrow. You were supposed to stay there. There is no architect, no layout, and no orderly pile of lumber that has been branded and is just mud and wood and whatever else If the landscape hasn't already claimed your house, it's not a house in the typical sense of the word. People consider one to be more of a weather and shelf compromise. Between work and deterioration, between what you required and what the land grudgingly consented to give you the rough-hewn frame to start. Wood from the closest trees that has been chopped with instruments that have gone through more hands than you can count, and the wood warps and bends slightly. However, after the frame is up, you weave, and neither do your walls. Between the pillars are thin branches or flexible sticks, a practice known as WLE. It's not. Even though it's not very fast, it's lovely and mostly cohesive. Like the remainder of your life, followed by the dorb, which is a mixture of muck, straw, dung, and you manually slap it on the water and squeeze it between the man. You pretend it's intentional as it dries slowly, breaking in the holes you smooth just enough to keep the wind out. You grow accustomed to the smell of the sun occasionally falling off in clumps that need to be renewed before winter. After a while, you cease to notice that the roof is made of layers of dry straw packed with thatch. Tightly bound and fastened to the beams, it is nearly golden when new. Lovely. Then the showers, then the birds, and finally the color fades, the edges become frayed, holes show up in unexpected places, and you begin. Don't shingle the buckets you put in locations you hoped you'd never have to. Instead of waterproofing it, you simply keep patching it until it looks like it will get even more patched than roof. You start to consider whether living beneath a cart could be more convenient. You persuade yourself that the floor is dirt since it's packed firmly and has been there for years. Walking, sweeping, stomping, and spilling have made it nearly solid, but when it freezes and rains, it softens once more. Who knows what's really going on when the goats enter for the night? You could cover it with rushes or straw underfoot. This would assist somewhat, but the straw quickly becomes wet, muddy, and covered in dust before being swept away. And begin again, or else the straw will soon become the floor, and you recognize it as a component of the landscape windows, which are actually wall apertures. In any case, flush glass is too costly and too uncommon to be covered with wooden shutters that swing awkwardly and never quite close. Too brittle, so the wind and the cold enter through the animal noises. There is a single door that is typically hanging, and occasionally the animals themselves enter through it. Little skewed, since the frame moved during the previous frost. It latches with a wooden peg or hook, is not for security. There is nothing to steal. Instead, you should keep the layout prevents the wind from wandering in, and the hens from straying out. Best described as sharing a single room, or two if someone was able to add a loft or lianto, but mainly just a place to sleep, dine, cook, speak, and fight, and hope that everyone resides here. Parents, kids, a couple of cousins, grandparents, perhaps a neighbor's youngster whose parents are absent, ill, or both in the middle, made of clay if you're not lucky, or stone if you are. There is essentially no chimney, and the smoke rises via a hole in the roof. The air within is consistently smoky, somewhat warm, slightly moist, and conveying the subtle aroma of stew that has been reheated too many times. There isn't much furniture, just a table and a bench. Perhaps a chest or stool if a member of your family has exceptional carving skills, or wooden frames filled with feathers or straw make for extremely fortunate marital beds. Blankets that squeak frequently are made of wool and are thick and never completely dry. The rafters include storage for garlic, onions, herbs, and possibly a small ham That year, the pig was nice, and you could smell the difference between early and late winter. Sometimes the air over your head seems soothing, and other times Since animals are a part of the home, the cow may actually slumber, serving as a reminder that you are almost out of supplies. It's not ideal to have hens and a goat in the same room, off in the corner. Is warm, but it's unhygienic. You have to learn to ignore the shuffles and clucks. They are included in the background sounds, along with the occasional frightened bleat in the middle of the night, similar to the wind in the thatch, where the creak's gradual settling walls, the floor dips, and the roof is not level, slants the walls, making them appear to be breathing in and out with. Every spring you swear, you correct what you can, and overlook what you can't. Every fall you'll fix the back wall, but it still leans. The house wasn't made to. Finally, it's a home designed to withstand the next storm, but despite all its imperfections, and a lot of them, it's home, where the cold comes in, and you know which roof beam you may hang by blocking it with an old sack, which one cacks when someone stands up and from what pot. Closely observe how the afternoon light streams through the slats, and when strangers walk by and notice poverty, the dog rolls up to sleep. You observe resourcefulness, effort, and a roof that hasn't yet collapsed as a triumph, a dry nook as a blessing, and a fire that continues to burn at morning is more valuable than gold, as is the moment you settle down at the end of the day, amid smoke, straw, snores, and stillness. You get a peculiar sense of comfort, not so much pride as presence, because this is it moves, bends, and leaks in the wind, but it's held. And on average, so have you. Medieval peasant cuisine lacked diversity in color, making it an unenjoyable experience. Or even all that warm, it was more like a problem that needed to be resolved on a regular basis. Repeatedly employing the same components and the same weary optimism that something, if you could label it a corner of your kitchen, edible might come out of it. There was no pantry or arranged shelves in your one-room house by the fireplace. There was only a pot and fire with ingredients, and no nicely placed herbs in a sunny window. Pottage was the focal point of almost every dinner, a sort of endless list of items you hoped hadn't gone bad. Stew that remained in the pot and continued to boil without ever stopping was never completely new and never completely gone. You added to it throughout the day. You kept it warm throughout the seasons, and didn't pray, so I skimmed it at night. When your back was turned, odd things grew in it. The ingredients varied depending on what. You didn't have much, but on a good day, you could have some cabbage, leeks, a few beans, barley, and sometimes onions or garlic. If it was winter, you used dried beans or peas if the harvest had been good. Particularly fortunate that a piece of salted pork might be thrown in more frequently. Even the bone itself was valued. You could boil it for days in the hopes that it would recall the flavor profile and how the meat tasted. Steady, earthy gray with a higher temperature than flavor. You ate pottage because it was what you had, not because you enjoyed it. At the end of the day, a warm supper was more than just a comfort food. It was a minor triumph that the pot itself never truly achieved. It was cleaned, occasionally scraped, but hardly ever scrubbed. There was no spice to mask the ghosts of the previous batch, which always absorbed them. It tastes like boiled food with a steady, unchanging dullness and no vinegar to add brightness. The second important player in history was bread, which was hard rather than soft, golden, or appealing. The soft white was typically prepared from oats, wheat, or rye barley, and it was dense and dark. Peasants could hardly afford to see it because it was reserved for the wealthier classes. The loaves were heavy and tiny, and they didn't rise much when baked. They disintegrated easily and could likely be used as a weapon if left out for a day. However, They provided you with something to soak in your stew and satisfied your hunger. Occasionally, dubious flours were used to make the bread, and they were mashed up. In poor times, folks utilized bark or peas or whatever was left over from the miller's barrel. Not figuratively, they actually crushed the innermost layer of tree bark and combined with the limited amount of wheat they possessed, resulting in starvation bread that was bitter, dense, and, technically, it kept you alive on days when even flour was indigestible. Scarce people used stale bread scraps and ditches, as these stew-soaked dishes were either consumed at the conclusion of the meal or discarded to the animals were occasionally handed down to a lower-ranking member of the bread hierarchy at their best protein. Was quite uncommon. Cows provided milk, poultry laid eggs, and you didn't consume your cattle unless you were forced to use all of the meat at that time. Fat organs, bones, and the head. The blood was used to make puddings. The most common meat was pork, which might turn into soup if nothing was wasted. Pigs were productive when they were available, and their salted fat tasted well. Numerous recipes frequently transformed something hardly edible into something ambiguously nice, but pigs were only killed when absolutely required. A full pig required weeks of whey. It was possible to plan salting, hanging, boiling, and storage fishing if you lived close to water, but even so, there were limitations because many rivers and lakes were governed by fishing without authorization could result in a fine or she. To make matters worse, you only fished for eels, little river fish, or anything that salted herring, which was a prize if you could obtain it, wouldn't spoil right away. A large portion of your food was prescribed by the church on Fridays, and meat was prohibited, so you switched to fishing or skipped it in more inventive times. Beaver. Stories were categorized as fish, a theological conclusion that few people challenged, because it indicated that while having milk was widespread, it was also brittle. It was considered a luxury in some cultures to use it rapidly or to make cheese or butter. Cheese was harder, tangier, and frequently used sparingly in homes. Quite dry, indicating that the cow had been stowed away if you had a few excellent rounds. Dairy was helpful that year, but it wasn't always popular with everyone. Without refrigeration, butter was made using sour milk. You simply trim around the worst areas of the rancid cheese mold. I hoped your stomach could withstand the bacteria that was in the basic water. Depending on the season and the upstream neighbor's negligence, it is frequently dangerous to drink. Ale, also referred to as tiny beer, was the standard weak ale that was made in households and consumed by everyone, even kids, because it contained only enough alcohol to eradicate microorganisms. If you had access to apples or pears, you could create them to quench your thirst. Noble milk was for the clergy, while cider wine was for the nobility. Otherwise, there was ale with breakfast, ale with lunch, and ale to the young and the ill. Remember that vegetables made up the majority of your diet today, and tomorrow will taste precisely the same. Turnips, cabbage, onions, and garlic-leek carrots, but not orange ones. As we now know, the majority of medieval carrots were produced in tiny plots and were either white or purple. Carefully managed and consumed from root to leaf, the turnip tops were not squandered. The fruit was seasonal apples, and the skins were either composted or thrown into the fire or boiled into greens. Mostly, perhaps some wild plums or berries, which would last if dried through the winter. If not, they were quickly consumed. Sugar was difficult to preserve. If you owned bees, honey was a cherished sweetener that was almost impossible to buy. Otherwise, the herbs in your pottage remained savory in the broadest meaning of the word. When feasible, they produced parsley, dill, mint, and sage. Weren't utilized as much for taste as for medication or custom. Some herbs were believed to prevent disease, others kept bugs away, and sometimes they even added flavor. A bit better, although that was a fortunate coincidence rather than the intended outcome. Meals were shared on benches. There were only a saucepan, a piece of bread, and a fire. There were no dishes or recipes. The hope that something would remain tomorrow and you wouldn't be whining didn't thicken the stew for a harvest festival, wedding, or feast. On Saint's Day, you could prepare a pie instead of the flaky, buttery sort, or roast a chicken. Medieval pies were more akin to sealed boxes composed of firm dough that contained a meat filling that was frequently highly spiced. Were accessible, which they typically weren't. You could add pepper to taste it. If someone has done well in trading, most days weren't feast days, therefore ginger or cinnamon. You scraped your bowl, soaked your bread, and drank your ale during the calm days. And you rested comfortably enough to endure the evening, if not precisely contented. Recurrence provided solace in knowing what the pot would tasted like, seeing the same hands create bread while knowing how much was left. Food prepared by the same fire, while the wind blew through the wall's crevices and the animals moved in there. You have enough if you slept, the stew cooked, the bread cooled, and you might have a small plot of land, but you didn't own much if you were a medieval peasant. A crooked house you made yourself, a few tools, and a few animals, but technically none of it was yours. Rather, it belonged to the Lord, not a monarch. Someone legendary or far away, simply your local landowner who resided higher up in a somewhat better prepared meal, a bit less shabby home, and a roof that most likely didn't leak because he owned the property and everything on it. In a way, you were what was referred to as a villain, which is not an insult. Rather, it's a type. You were obligated to the land even though you didn't own it. You owed labor goods, so you couldn't leave without permission or freely pass it on. Respect. Although you weren't a slave, you weren't completely free either. Conversation wasn't the foundation of a relationship with the Lord. Rather, it was obligation. Instead, you spoke with the steward, the man who oversaw his properties, and more crucially, made sure that everyone was paid. Owing a lot, so let's begin with work, a couple of days a week, occasionally more. You were supposed to work the Lord's fields during harvest rather than your own. Was referred to as, quote, corv labor, and you received no compensation. No thanks, only the awareness that someone ate something in the manor house because of what you owed taxes as well, and they took many different forms. A percentage of your grain, a portion of your wool, a chicken, eggs, and if you made ale, if you caught fish, guess what you owed? If you had a pig, you owed bacon. Food taxes didn't stop with the owner of the river if you utilized the mill. Even though it was the sole method to grind your grain, you could be persuaded to grind it, even though the Lord controlled the mill and determined the price. By hand, but doing so was frequently prohibited and subject to fines, or worse, since the Lord desired control rather than simply his share. If you tried baking at home, you had to pay to use the common oven that many homes possessed. And the steward learned that there can be repercussions. Therefore, you should learn to do things the official method, even if it was more expensive and time-consuming. And then there were the expenses for wanting to inherit and wanting to get married. There is a price for your father's property. If you like to relocate to a different community first, ask permission, and guess what? You have to pay a charge to have your tools and cattle taxed. Occasionally made it difficult for you to breed without authorization, untaxed, and what did you receive in exchange? In theory, the Lord was meant to keep you safe in case bandits invaded or if. When a rival noble invaded, the Lord had armed men ready to battle in the event of hunger. He might occasionally give away grain from his stores for free. And if you had a valid claim that your neighbor's goat entered your garden and wouldn't, this was feudalism. Leaving the Lord's court could result in a different, less amicable resolution, a hierarchical and duty structure encased in terms of loyalty and, in actuality, protection was a system of land ownership. Everyone followed the manor, both those who worked there and those who owned it. itself occasionally situated literally on higher land, separating it from the village. It could be larger than any peasant's house, constructed of stone or wood, and have a roof thatched so tightly that no breeze could get inside. There were tapestries on the tables, attendants, and the lord himself, all of whom were dressed in fur-lined wool, consuming unimaginable food and pondering deeply. He may not have known your name, but he was aware of how much you were worth. How many eggs did you pledge to give this year? Barley. Did your son meet his goal? The age at which he might be joined to the labor rolls was documented, but you were unable to read it. However, the steward, Reeve, gave the bafe men wax tablets or pieces of parchment who asked you questions. You learned to carefully respond to them, and if you didn't meet your duties, penalties, fines, and typically extra days of goods taken added to your work. In severe circumstances, your equipment may be seized or you lost everything you had, including your house, goats, dignity, and reclaimed land. The peculiar thing is that resisting resistance wasn't rebellion. Rather, it was folly. The system functioned because it was steady and had rules, not because it was fair. You knew what you owed and what was expected there, so it was predictable, even if it was severe. There were no surprises or guesses, just a constant rhythm of give, and the Lord would sometimes, just sometimes, return something. Food distribution during a feast day, a holiday where workers were given a kind, perhaps a word from a horse is insufficient to counterbalance the magnitude, but sufficient to prevent the connection from deteriorating, was never, your Lord may be young or old, gentle or harsh, but it was enduring. Whether he was nearby or far away, he was always above you, so you bowed without doubt. You took off your cap after he passed, and you spoke appropriately, not because he deserved it, but due to your desire to avoid conflict, and perhaps because a tiny portion of you continued to hold out hope that you might one day be recognized and rewarded, lifted even slightly, which hardly ever occurred. But that's how the system survived, not only out of terror, but also with a glimmer of optimism that if I prayed loudly enough, worked hard enough, and obeyed for a long enough period of time, change, while the reeve continued to right the mill and the steward continued to walk. Year after year you continued to grind and sink your hands into the ground. Season after season, there was no upward mobility, no bonus, and no retirement. Movement, merely the silent awareness that you have performed your task. You had survived another year while carrying the burden of someone else's title, and you were permitted to continue alive as long as the Lord approved. Long before Europe was overtaken by the Black Death, and its legacy was cemented. The works that medieval peasants were already familiar with illness, but not the type of illness that changed with the seasons. There was a lot of that as well, but the gradual, ongoing presence of an infection, fever, wasting, edema, or whatever else, is always ready to go wrong. Coughing illness wasn't an occurrence. Rather, it was a natural part of life that didn't require all it needed for a continent-wide disaster to be brought low was a single little snip. Flee a small amount of water that, unlike weather or taxes, appeared clear but wasn't. Illness didn't follow the rules. It rarely departed, and it came without notice. If you were fortunate, your village would have no hospitals. Had a knowledgeable woman, perhaps a midwife, who knew which herbs to boil and which ones to burn. If you were very fortunate, a monk may be present, well-meaning, nearby literate, and marginally more successful than random prayer. But you mostly stayed to home and laid in bed when you were ill. You hoped that most people wouldn't comprehend what you were sweating through your shirt. The term germ had not yet been coined, and microscopes had been around for millennia. What you had were theories, some of which were outdated, unclear, and frequently incorrect. Thought that the air I had asthma in was contaminated by the stench of The smoke and rotted manure in the community were thought to be dangerous, which was true, but not for the reasons that people believed to fight against the filthy air, wore flowers in their sleeves, put herbs into their clothing, or strolled about with cloths drenched in vinegar pushed against their cheeks. This is not helpful or pleasant, yet firmly held that some people blamed disease on sin and divine punishment. If your child became unwell, it was a sign of immoral behavior, disobedient thinking, or general moral degradation. If your body failed after your crops failed, it was most likely your responsibility. Or your neighbors, or both. There were customs in the area. Some believed that the evil eye, a jealous person's stare, or angry people blamed gloomy or animal spirits or moon periods. One of the most widely accepted theories among saints was that illness entered the body through the soles of the feet. Boil them in the solution, and if that doesn't work, burn anything close by. Perhaps your mattress. The remedies were as peculiar as the reasons. If you were sick with a fever, you could be bled. A local guy would show up with a bowl, a razor, and greater assurance than leeches, and sharp stones were utilized in training, and the goal was to balance your, if the humors, blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were not in sync, then they were naturally. No one ever saw these jokes, yet they were held accountable for almost everything to relieve the edema, included pusses, mud smears, mashed herbs, or even some prepared bread that was wrapped in fabric and fast. Worse, but the fact that something was being done was what mattered. If you coughed up blood, you might chew on charcoal to relieve your stomach pain. If someone's eyes were blurry, drink wine with crushed pearls. Might blow smoke over your head while whispering a prayer. If your leg turned black, you most likely had no other choices. And then there was the disease. Amulets, which are pieces of bone or metal worn around the neck and occasionally engraved with. Some people buried onions in the ground, while others used words of protection or were blessed by a priest. Others hung garlic above the door in the corners of their houses, and bringing live chickens to the contaminated region in the hopes that the birds may contract the disease. Though it didn't happen often, people held on to anything they could, because there wasn't much hope. Perhaps illness was isolating, but not in the sense that we typically think of. You tried to work instead of putting yourself under quarantine or calling for assistance, until you were unable to, at which point you lay down while others continued. Children were fed animals. You were fed broth and perhaps some whispered prayers, but occasionally sickness overcame When the fever subsided and the swelling subsided, you resumed your slow new limping gait. Sometimes it didn't, and your family lit a fire, and other times it did. In a larger sense, the candle plague wasn't always the horrific type that left people dead in. More frequently, it was a gradual infection that caused darkening of the skin, swelling of the limbs, and coughing, leprosy, smallpox, and a depth that could shake the walls. Dissension. Even if a hamlet had a flu outbreak and half of the people were bedridden, there were no cases. Just the tales of a wanderer from a different village. No figures or charts claimed that someone heard that 3, or that the cough had begun there last week. When you noticed that kids had perished close to the river, you began to boil more. You stored your herbs and water beneath the door. Even while no one explained why death wasn't always feared, distance was recognized. Individuals were aware of the warning indications and knew when it was close. There were prayers for the dying as the skin slowed and the eyes grew drab. When the Black Death finally arrived, gentle ones spoke by firelight. It came in the 14th century, and it struck with a ferocity that overshadowed anything else prior to it. But the world was already accustomed to illness by that point. Though it was more common during the plague, the notion that you may be fine in the morning and sick at night was not new. Arrived in waves, and each time it did, the stranger bubbos became stronger and the fever in the neck and groin that clouded and bubbled people's minds, killed in a matter of days or hours, and entire villages disappeared. Fields continued till some peasants heard bells ringing too frequently, attempted to escape, but as illness spreads more quickly than feet, some turned to religion. Some resorted to violence, increasing their prayers, beating their backs and vowing to live better if they were spared. Blaming sinners, outsiders, or anyone other than the church provided consolation, explanations, and burials. Monks perished in large numbers. Priests disappeared in some locations. Deaths grew so frequent that people skipped funerals, and instead people were interred in mass graves, frequently without names, but life went on. Learnt to live with illness. They accepted it in the same way that they accepted cold or hunger. Not happily, but with a rather worn-out fortitude. They cleaned their houses more frequently, muttered new prayers, and swapped herbs. Some thought that the surviving one. Others didn't believe at all that illness provided them with protection from the next. Nevertheless, they rose and milked the cow, and the kids learned as they grew up which plants should be chewed and which should be boiled until they quit. They were adept at healing wounds and had a foot odor. How to determine when someone won't recover from a fever and when you should give up hope. Yet they continued to live, get married, and harvest despite everything. They shared meals together, sat by the fire, and recounted tales of the final sickness and the instance in which a person's grandfather escaped a case of winter fever with. The scourge of stubbornness and nothing but garlic water wasn't the end of the globe, and for those who managed to survive, it was just another aspect of it, turned into a form of resistance of its own, a silent, unyielding reluctance to leave softly, and the conviction that tomorrow would arrive, and someone else would remember your name or at least the root if it didn't. In the medieval countryside, you always put rosemary to the broth night, didn't you? Serene. It was quiet in the way a cave is quiet, despite the distant noises of creaks, the type of silence that allows you to perceive how loud your own body is. When the light went out and everything that hadn't been put away earlier was put away, the day came to an end. Had to be handled promptly, since as soon as night fell, there were no candles or artificial light, and the world shrank to the size of your half. If you had a tallow lamp, blazing freely into the night was too valuable, was kept for emergencies or religious devotions. On most evenings the coals were muted. You slept, but not in the sense we imagine, because you only faintly shined. In the Middle Ages, sleep came in two parts, rather than in one continuous stretch. Behaves in a cycle of first sleeping, then waking, and then sleeping again. Wasn't a coincidence. Rather, it was a way for people to adjust to the lengthy periods of darkness between nightfall and... You would fall asleep for the first time before dawn, and shortly after nightfall, the fire would be banked, children would be silenced, and animals would have been quieted. 1 or 2 rooms at home could extend out into silence. If your mattress was filled with feathers or straw, it might have been bumpy, frequently shared. If not, you slept on the ground or on woven rushes. Softened only by habit, everyone slept together, including staff and family members, all in one common area, not because they were near, but rather because they had to. Even animals were taken into the house's lone, warm chamber on the coldest evenings. A dog curled up by the fireplace, a goat at the entrance, hens in a... There was no privacy, and the idea of basket warmth was more significant than limits. Sleeping alone was seen as a punishment rather than a source of comfort, which the wealthy might... Everyone else merely made you afford isolation, so did you turn to the wall, breathing in each other's breath, sharing blankets and stuffing straw in your ear's breath, and if someone consistently snored, you initially get accustomed to it. After a few hours of sleep, people would wake it up almost at the same time. Wasn't upsetting, it was normal for this period of time. At midnight, everything was silent and still. Some individuals prayed, while others roused the fire, while some went outside into the icy cold or used the chamber toilet. Some pondered, while others muttered that it was a period of overly vivid dreams. A thin veil between the living and the dead was said to be opened by this midnight void. If you dreamed during this time, you would see the dead between the sacred and the ordinary. You talked about it the following morning after remembering it throughout the waking interval, in passing, but in the end, the second nap was important. Started out slower and deeper, this was the sleep that attempted to heal, or, if you were lucky, the ache subsided a little as the blisters from the day cooled. Unbroken. If not, you just lay motionless and waited for the sunrise to provide a reason to. Despite the fire, the house didn't completely become silent at night. A baby might fuss, a cow might, as the crackling wind whispered through the thatch. Wet, rattling coughing occasionally shattered the night as it shuffled its hooves, never seemed to end, and although everyone saw it, nobody spoke. Realized that the fear of the dark was genuine and not a figment of the imagination. Actual threats, such as imagined and completely corporeal wolves, for example, in certain regions, they weren't only animals. Their howls were close enough to the village to make you shiver. Legend has it that they were hungry and real, but then there came robbers. Strangers and rogues ignited fires with reckless coal roofs that moaned beneath them. You didn't speak about snow and less explicable things like ghosts, spirits, demons, and witches, openly discussing them, but you were aware that they were there to safeguard the home. You made the sign of the cross above and put the iron beside the door as part of the ceremonies. Over the straw mattress, herbs such as rosemary, sage, and rue were strung, and the hearth murmured blessings of protection. Occasionally, you would tie a small piece of string around a child's wrist just in front of entryways. Even with protection, some families thought that sleeping made you more susceptible, that people curled in because the soul wandered while the body slept. Mirrors that were meticulously covered faced the bed and the fire. Avoid sleeping with your feet pointing toward the door because it's cold. Adversary, it penetrated walls through thatch and inadequately sealed doors. People layered wool fur cloaks instead of sleeping under piles of blankets. The thought of taking off your clothes for bed would have seemed ludicrous. That you occasionally slept in your boots there while still wearing your clothing was both comforting and uncomfortable to sleep near to other people. Someone usually whispered that there were elbows, knees, and sometimes the family dog surprised you, but this was expected. You weren't expecting quiet. Anticipated intimacy, and within that intimacy, you discovered an odd sense of security that your grandmother murmured a prayer, your child twitched, and you heard your father breathe. It wasn't quiet while she slept, but it was human and shared while you dreamed. A field of wheat might indicate prosperity, a snake illness, or your dreams mattered. A damaged tooth might be fatal. You either learned to read these signs, or you discovered that, although not formally, the community had dream readers. The church had its own thoughts and cautioned that some dreams were dangerous, but everyone knew who to ask. Were from the devil, who said that you could be tempted while you were asleep. Were instructed to pray before bed in order to keep your soul prepared by avoiding specific ideas. In case it was your last night, because folks might have gone to bed and didn't wake up. A fever may develop while you were sleeping. Coughing may worsen, and by morning, someone may have vanished in silence, as if every dawn had a somewhat solemn tone when the light was stolen because of this uncertainty. Returned, the coals were roused to life, and the rooster called out, indicated that you had survived once more. You sat up gradually, and each joint brought back memories of your age, regardless of how young you were. You cleaned your face after the cold stung your nose. You surveyed the area and counted the bodies, making sure that everyone who stirred was present. After the alive were verified, everyone who wasn't was checked on. The day started with the fetching of water, the preparation of bread, the feeding of animals, and the dream you. If it was significant, it was shared, and the night's memories dimmed rather than vanished, simply melted and folded into the subsequent winter sleep period. It started early and stayed late throughout the summer, but the rhythm maintained the same. Wake up, sleep for a second, and imagine a world without clocks, but not without habit. And despite the discomfort, that rhythm had a calming effect. Anything sincere. You didn't seek solace. Instead, you sought endurance, as well as a little break, if you managed to discover one along the road. Warmth, a very peaceful night, and a dream that stayed with you. Unfortunately, you didn't receive that gift. First question. Some years you're just hungry and didn't anticipate gaining too much. When you experience a famine in other years, the hunger is not as severe and may be controlled. Regulations. You limit food, you stretch it, and you hope, but famine violates the regulations. When the fields fail, the root cellar is left naked, and there is no more feigning improvement for the following week. In a medieval town, food becomes more of an idea than a physical item. Frequently anticipated it. It began in the spring, when there was either too much or no rain, and the barley appeared, spotty. The cabbages burst open too soon, the beans blossomed and then browned, and wheat heads remained bent and stunted as if they were already grieving for something you observed that everyone did. First, nobody mentioned anything, but glances were exchanged. Calculations done in private to determine how much is left over from the previous year. The answers were never satisfactory. Can we preserve the seed? How much can we afford to eat? The most difficult aspect was figuring out what to do next, not in the winter, but in summer, since you had to decide whether to plant the seeds or converting them to flour in order to feed your child or save for an uncertain harvest. One more bowl of something warm, and the stew's servings started to get smaller, became thinner, the bread shrank, and the dishes weren't returned empty. Instead, they simply returned less frequently. But you persuaded yourself this happened and didn't fear yet, previously, that a different village might have more, or that the manor stores could cover the gaps, and there was yet hope. Little else. But by August it was more difficult to ignore, and by September it's unthinkable that you stopped feeding the animals. The goats were bleeding, and the hens were silent at first, got hollow. If you had a dog, it stopped barking and began to follow. You comprehended it better, and the following bread became a ritual 1 loaf. Split 5 ways, everyone nibbled more slowly, and nobody gave the crust any criticism, not even the stew was now essentially water after the tiniest crumb was reverently cleaned up. It came from the kettle you used to cook the weeds you ground if it had color. You didn't sleep, so you dug up things you didn't know were there and hoped they weren't toxic. Throughout the night, not out of fear, but rather as a reminder from your stomach. Every several hours when it remained empty, the kids asked less questions. They didn't inquire as to when the bread was delivered, so you knew it was authentic. Coming, they sat by the fire and didn't beg for stories or ask for honey. Stared, they figured out how to wait, and you stopped seeing your neighbors. There was silence outside the village. There was no more alley laughter or quarrels regarding sheep, except the sporadic cough or firewood crack. People were silent during starvation, but it didn't make them harsh. Occasionally, someone would bringing back a bird, a rabbit, or some soaked in ground acorns. You grinned despite the fact that they still tasted harsh after chewing them, because it was something you tried not to despise, even though it tasted nice. The way the steward arrived. Occasionally they donated grain, and other times they did not. Less, which was both beneficial and detrimental because he wasn't there to take anything. Unfortunately, he wasn't there to assist, and his silence spoke more than words. After service, the church could never have done what it could to provide bread and guns for the poorest, but they were also stretched, so you prayed more, not because you believed, but because it's simple to repeat words when your hands are too exhausted to perform any other tasks. The entire town packed up and went in search of food, employment, or perhaps God. Returned some, didn't you? You were too exhausted to inquire about what transpired. Body changes. During starvation, you initially feel your ribs from the inside rather than the outside. When they're too near your skin, you stand up more slowly and get bruises. It's easier when you wake up with your fists clenched, as if you're still holding on to tools that you can no longer afford. And you spend more time caring for the fire, which is your dearest buddy, even though the cold hurts more, than you've ever cooked on it, sat near it, slept with your back to it, and fed it, even when your stomach is empty, since the only pleasure you can still enjoy is heat. As long as you've consumed everything that might be consumed, even the weeds and roots. The stale flour, the dry beans, and the bones you've boiled 3 times. Your tooth split after baking hunger bread with wet bark, and when the food was gone, you turned your attention to items that weren't food but could be if the light lever was boiled and salty, unsatisfying, and theoretically chewable. You've found a rat. You thank God that you didn't scream, then you concealed it, cooked it by yourself, and said no. Even though you don't regret anything, you still feel bad about it, and your dreams start to seem weird. Imagine dinner tables laden with bread, wine, and roasts. When you wake up, you're chewing even if you haven't boiled anything, you still having dreams about it. Anything you dream about animals returning in 3 days. When you see green sprouts emerging from the snow, you remember your early years when there was no such thing as easier, and sometimes you wake up from those sobbing dreams after feeling satisfied. The cemetery expanded gradually at first, then too swiftly for you to keep up with. When the church bell didn't ring, it was a sign that someone had passed away, since there weren't enough hands to hoist the rope to the grave. Was brief. The grieving was brief, and the prayer was, everyone had their own want to satisfy, so you wanted to be quiet and grieve, but you suppressed the emotion since you couldn't afford it, just like everything else at the time. Every famine ended gradually, with rain falling and remaining the same. You had enough when the ground-softened seeds sprouted into feeble but genuine plants. Vitality to hope once more, since you preserved the first crop for the children and elders of others. Next you passed the tiniest bowl with a smile, and when the first nice loaf came out of the oven, it was black on the bottom and cracked on top. Looked at it before eating, recalling each day you went. You spared someone by using every lie you said and every tactic you employed. Otherwise you ate slowly, and by the time you were able to walk, you were full. When you were baptized, the church already had your name on file, sewed your soul into a garment, and graced your breath with Latin you would never understand, system that went well beyond your community, and you're a member of the church. Yet because you had no other choice in the peaceful nooks of your life, but because you decided, to those gloomy, early mornings prior to the fire starting, those rainy evenings when through the shutters you could feel the wind howling. It wasn't just there next to you. Life was structured, assessed, taxed, pardoned, and defined what followed. The air around you and the road were more important than the church. It was the voice that whispered over the rhythm of your year beneath your feet. The one who whispered about your grave decades before you arrived. The only person who could read was frequently the village priest, not simply your confessional, he was also your counselor and calendar. And he was the closest thing you had to an oracle. He knew the secrets of the sky and the saints' tales and understood why a storm would arrive or a pig might perish. Carried your sins to him in his robes as he strolled through the village like a man bearing both blessing and threat. Murmurs hoping he wouldn't appear let down, You made an effort to ignore what he recognized him from birth, marriage, and death, without the sole assurance. He spoke for a God you feared in between the rituals of a peasant's life. More than you loved because you were told that love was necessary. The Mass was conducted in strict Latin, which may have passed for a spell. Standing next to your family in the church, your feet numb from the cold, you were unaware of the priest's remarks, which never belonged to you, as he lifted the bread, but you thought or attempted to do something that wasn't obvious. The muttering of words wasn't wine, and the bread wasn't bread, and gestures may communicate with the holy without using words, yet they passed through you in whatever way, and you crossed where you could by mouthing. You were able to learn the beat of holiness like someone else when the others did. Discovers the way to success without fully comprehending each step, just that when you needed it, the church carved out the times for you to fast and feast. You didn't say March, but year into holy pieces, Lent, Advent, Epiphany, and All Saints, or April. You mentioned that it advised you what you may do after Easter or close to St. Michael's Eat when it's available, and how bad it is to indulge in it after 40 days without meat, before Easter Friday. Fish, even if you survived, was followed by a feast so lavish that it made you feel lightheaded. For the wealthy turnips, water, almond milk, and on saint days, you shared what you could quickly on, leaving everyone else with cold broth. On certain days you dreamed of things you couldn't, but even when your plate was empty, was packed with regulations, and your calendar served as both a payment and a place for prayer. Regardless of the season, the church received a tenth of your produce, including grain, eggs, and wool. If it originated from your body or your field, chicken cider had a cost. You were told to give since it was God's share, but God didn't. The steward, with his ledgers and his silent voice, or the priest collected it. As you nodded, you saw your finest barley being transported to the tithe barn, which was always larger than your house. You witnessed your neighbors giving the priest their final bag of oats. They had just paid for it, and when the harvest failed, they asked for compassion. The demand remained the same whether the rains were too late or the frost arrived too early. What you owed. Occasionally, they will allow you to pay with labor or candles. Sometimes, even when you stood up, the weight of the debt made your back bend. Honorable, but the church didn't just accept it even though it wasn't constantly in the way. You desired it because it provided structure, narrative, and the priest instructed you on which saint to pray to when your cow died for no apparent reason. When your child was sick, he informed you that it may be a test, a punishment, or, by entering via a gap in your faith, the devil provided blessings and sacraments, instructed you to visit a shrine or light a candle, and occasionally he gave you a piece of remnant of a tooth, an old bone, or a ribbon dipped in some forgotten. You treasured the blood of martyr. It did not always work, but even when it did, St. Apollonia had saints for everything, so it was better than nothing, wasn't it? For teeth, St. Sebastian for plague, and St. Isidore for plowing, only knew their names and what they were able to fix. You had no idea where they were buried or when they lived. Stories were narrated by people who were half magic and half memory in the flickering firelight. Were unsure of the boundary between reality and myth, therefore you called them. When you had nothing more, you knelt in the kettle or stirred it while whispering their names. Field, you struck agreements with them, promising them a pilgrimage, bread or fasting if only. They would occasionally assist you, and that was sufficient to ask if they did or appeared to. Once more, pilgrimage served as a means of both obtaining take a short vacation. You ventured outside the same 5 miles, where you spent your entire life traveling along unknown roads to places you had only heard about. You bound yourself to your back and held your prayers in your... You arrived with a footsaw, and your hands slept in barn corners or behind hedges, and roar stood in front of a statue or bone, hoping that something would change within. Sometimes you came back not healed, but transformed, or at least exhausted, sufficient to think that death itself was a rite performed by the key, When you sensed the church was getting close, you called for the priest, who arrived with oil, and he tried to calm your soul by touching your forehead and praying over your body. As your family assembled and the candles were lit, the bell might ring. If you were strong enough, you were interred next to someone who had walked the same route, and then the throng arrived, and your family lighted more. Prayers were paid for with candles, and I hope the priest remembered your name. Chance, because the church taught that your spirit had debts even after death, may not enter paradise immediately. Instead, it may remain in a dark corridor known as purgatory. Years or decades could pass between pain and salvation, or longer until someone offered assistance, lit enough candles, or prayed, uttered your name enough times to keep you going, so your family did what they could. The affluent supplied bread, the poor paid what they could, donated all of the property to shorten a stay in a location that nobody had seen but everyone feared, since the church also used fear as a gift, explaining the poor. When no one else could explain to you why the rains didn't come, why did disease take the young and spare the young? Your child didn't wake up. Brutal, telling you that obedience had a reward and that pain had a purpose. Provided you with order amidst turmoil, and that order even when it troubled. You provided you with peace. Not always comfort, but peace you never asked for. You might complain about the tithe, but don't take the church's authority seriously, or swear when the priest turned away. But you continued to exhibit. When the bell rang, you continued to kneel and cross yourself. Rang, because if the church was in the wrong place, the universe would be completely shapeless. And even when the priest drank too much, the shapeless world was a terrible thing. When the indulgent vendor went through town with a cart full of taxes, yet the bishop still requested excessive taxes, pledges, and a coin-filled purse that you either acted on or continued to believe, similar to what you did, which ultimately remained mostly unchanged because beliefs were less about. Although you didn't grasp the Latin, your thoughts were different from your actions. You remained inside the framework because you understood it to be the only path ahead, and when you passed away, you wanted the candles to burn, the bells to ring, and your name to appear, would be mentioned enough times to be significant that you hoped the saints would still listen to you, and hoped that your transgressions had been equally acknowledged and pardoned. In all its weight, mystery, dust, and gold, you prayed the church would bring you the last distance. You may believe that following everything they endured, following the plagues and famines, following the taxes and tithes, and peasants would have rebelled against the man's oppressive boot. More frequently, that the burden of decades of hardship would have accumulated until it caused their town's walls to fracture, until the frost would appear one chilly morning. You could imagine that if they thawed, something inside of them would have, with fire in their hearts and tools in hand, people gathered in marketplaces and fields and yelled that they no longer kneel, but they didn't do it frequently, for extended periods of time, or all at once. Yes, there were uprisings in the past, like the English peasant revolt in the Jacquerie in France in 1381. A few decades previously, there were minor rebellions all over, like stones tossed into a still pond. Europe is filled with irate voices in locations where the lords had charged 1 penny too many, taken too much, and pressed too hard. Occasionally, the spark ignited a steward run and destroyed a tax collector's home. A banner was raised outside the town, but the fires quickly burned out. Even more quickly, they were executed on gallows constructed in the village. Squares in quiet, heavier than the last one, and the world remained the same. To understand why peasants did not revolt, the grain still needed to be sowed. Furthermore, You must cease considering them to be cowards or foolish. They were survivors of years of unrelenting suffering rather than isolated disasters. Hope was something that was rationed in their world of low ceilings throughout that year. In a life where every day was spent just, they lacked margin, not boldness. There was not enough room to keep the soup heated and the roof repaired. Insurrection. You could either dig potatoes or organize a revolt, but you couldn't do both at the same time. The system functioned not because it was merely kind or effective, but rather because it was old and had become ingrained in generations' customs. Yet it didn't need to be clarified. It was just that you owed work. You owed the Lord his crop, the church its tenth, and a peaceful nod. You were born into that obligation when the reeve passed your door, and unless you, we're really fortunate that you also perished in it. But by remaining inside those lines, yes, you could barely make it, but you could pay the price for going outside of those. The church had soldiers, the mana had soldiers, and the regulations were excessively strict. Excommunication. The monarch had laws that still applied even though he was unaware of your existence. You like rope, and sometimes the punishment for disobedience wasn't death. Harsher famine and exile, leaving your family to bear the burden of the debt you attempted to avoid. Everyone had heard a tale about a father who abducted a mother, thrashed a cousin, and vanished after. Stories about non-payment were transmitted not to incite revolt, but to stop it, in addition to the fact that rebellion frequently didn't seem like a choice because your neighbors weren't strangers, they were members of your family. You shared fields, tools, fences, and prayers with your neighbors. You could still wed the steward's daughter even if you detested him. Even if you didn't like the tithe, you brought bread to Mass because the village wasn't a place. It wasn't one you could break apart without tearing, and you could leave with ease. Tearing yourself to pieces in order to rebel against the method was in some tiny way. It's simple to rebel against your own life's rhythms years later. Imagine the peasant with their head bent and hat, in a position of perpetual servitude. However, this image fails to capture the complexity of their reality, where slavery was not the same as capitulation. The majority of peasants did not only endure hardships, instead, they adjusted and bartered. Bent. They discovered wall fissures and established dwellings in the areas between the regulations. A bribe given, an additional sack of rye buried in the ground, and a pig kept off the ledger. They were sensible individuals who could afford to protest in eggs rather than coins. Their universe was ruled by weather rather than philosophy. The question was not what is fair, but can it last us through the winter? If justice did arrive, it was a luxury they didn't believe in. Yet lords supplanted priests, rules altered. But you didn't rebel against the wind, the necessity to turn the land, or the children's cries of hunger. That you persevered, and the church contributed as well, if not more. More successfully than the sword, it conveyed the idea that pain was sacred. Although it was never stated, forbearance was righteous, in that the humble would inherit the earth. When you were instructed that your difficulties weren't meant to be punishment, but cleansing, so that your obedience would be rewarded in the hereafter rather than in this life. Then, and if the assurance of heaven wasn't sufficient, the fear of damnation filled the gnashing of rest, fire, agony, teeth, all awaiting the arrogant, disobedient, and those who refused. Yet, although their resistance was more subdued, the peasants were not inactive. Instead, they engaged in gossip regarding They sung offensive songs concerning the Lord's customs, stewards. They recounted stories at night and giggled when the priest stumbled onto one of their sermons. The tiniest deeds they performed together gave them dignity in better times and better men. Crust, a field tended slightly differently than the norm, and a well-timed silence. The book claimed that their resistance was the reason they managed to survive in spite of everything, not because they agreed with the system, but because they manipulated it to allow them to. Naturally, things changed occasionally. For example, a nobleman passed away, and his son was the strong, were reminded by a violent storm that a new bishop, Kinder, had forgiven debts. That the changes originated from above, even if they were mortal. It was the peasants' responsibility to wait, endure, pass on what little they had, and to educate their kids to be bold when they can, and to be quiet when they must. You might not have called it, but there were dreams, of course. Revolution, but you envisioned a different destiny in which you would one day, when no one would knock on your door, your child wouldn't have to bear the same difficulties, when your back wouldn't hurt before 30, and you could sleep soundly with a list of Jews. Your nightmares of wolves, troops, or cold kept you going, but they lived alongside reality. You needed them to survive, but you didn't expect them to come true. The most astounding thing, perhaps, is not that peasants revolted so infrequently, but that they were able to preserve their families, culture, and faith. They continued to perform songs that no one recorded, even though the system was weighing heavily on them. Tales from one side to the other, recalling which herbs provided healing and which. Did they not teach each other how to pray, give birth, and bury the dead? They established a continuity that endured beyond the reigns of monarchs and the Crusades, and they did so with battles or banners. But their perseverance was what rebelled when the church taxed their sins, but they managed to live when the manna demanded too much. Even when the world turned against them, they continued to light candles, huddled together and awaited spring. Even if the fields were owned by someone else, the earth still recalled that the revolution did not reside in their hands as it would later. Centuries in radical statements or the catchphrases of crowds, but there was a certain power in the manner in which they lived a difficult life without allowing it to totally harden you, was a form of defiance in and of itself to kneel because you knew you could get back up, not because you were weak. They persevered because tomorrow was another instance of resistance. They persevered in the tempo of the plow, silently, without monuments or songs inscribed in their names. In the lullabies sung next to dying people, in the smoke rising from cottages at nightfall, stories whispered to children who would grow up and talk of the burns they endured. History frequently overlooks them or tucks them into a footnote under rulers. Great victories, but the peasants served as the glue that kept the whole thing together. Harvests, churches, and armies would not have existed without them. March with banners, they created the world, and despite being denied ownership, they might not depose their rulers, but they outlived them, and perhaps that is enough of a revolution.